In October of 1974, I arrested a man in Boundary County, Idaho, who was not entirely a man. I held him in my jail for 14 hours. I took his photograph, his fingerprints, and a set of physical measurements that I recorded in longhand on a standard booking form. I had a doctor examine him. I had 2 of my deputies witness that examination. By morning, the cell was empty. The bars were stressed in a way I could not explain, and 2 men I had never seen before arrived at my office with federal credentials and left 90 minutes later with every piece of paper I had generated in connection with that arrest. When I asked what agency they were from, one of them told me it was not a matter I needed to concern myself with. I have thought about those words almost every day since. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Harlan Voss. I am 79 years old. I served as a deputy sheriff in Boundary County from 1969 through 1972, and then as the elected sheriff of Boundary County from January of 1973 through January of 1989. 16 years in that office. I ran unopposed 3 times. The people of Bonners Ferry trusted me, and I took that seriously. Boundary County is the northernmost county in Idaho. It sits in the Panhandle, pressed up against the Canadian border to the north and the Washington state line to the west. The county seat, Bonners Ferry, sits in the Kootenai River Valley, which is flat agricultural bottomland ringed on all sides by mountains. The Selkirk Range rises to the east. The Purcell Mountains press in from the north. It is beautiful country, genuinely and deeply beautiful, the kind that gets into your blood in your 20s and never fully lets go. The population in 1974 was somewhere around 6,000 people, spread across nearly 1,200 square miles of terrain. My department in that year consisted of myself, 3 full-time deputies, 1 part-time dispatcher, and a county prosecutor named Alan Geddes, who also handled civil work and the occasional real estate closing to pay his mortgage. I want to be specific about the geography because it matters to the story. Bonners Ferry itself sits on the west bank of the Kootenai River at roughly 1,800 feet in elevation. The mountains surrounding the valley climb quickly and sharply. The Selkirk Crest, 10 miles east of town, reaches above 7,000 feet in multiple places. The terrain between the valley floor and those high ridges is old-growth mixed conifer forest, a mix of western red cedar, Douglas fir, western larch, and grand fir, with drainages that in many places had not been seriously logged and had not seen a maintained trail in decades. The Idaho Panhandle National Forest administered most of that land, the result of a 1973 consolidation of the older Coeur d'Alene, Conixu, and Street Joe National Forests into a single administrative unit with headquarters in Coeur d'Alene. The Forest Service had a ranger district office in Bonners Ferry, and I worked with those rangers regularly on everything from wildfire response to illegal dumping to the occasional bear complaint when a hunter left a gut pile too close to a campground. I say all of this because I want you to understand the landscape before I tell you what came out of it. A county of 6,000 people and 1,200 square miles of mountains means that most of those mountains have no people in them at any given time. You could hide almost anything up there. You could be born up there, live your entire life up there, and never come within line of sight of another human being if you were careful and if you knew the country. Whoever Caleb was, he knew the country. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of October, 1974. My dispatcher at the time was a woman named Betty Krause, who had been with the department longer than I had and who had a gift for staying calm when things were not calm. Betty came over the radio and told me that a caller near milepost 47 on Highway 95, about 7 miles north of town, had reported a very large man walking south along the highway shoulder. The caller, a farmer named Clint Whitehorn who ran a small cattle operation on the benchlands above the valley, had slowed his truck and tried to speak with the man. The man had not responded and had kept walking south with his eyes fixed straight ahead. Clint told Betty he was walking barefoot, appeared to be in some kind of distress, and was, In Clint's own words, the biggest human being he had ever laid eyes on. I took the call myself. I drove north on Highway 95 and found him about a mile south of where Clint had reported him. So he had covered that ground fast on foot. He was walking on the highway shoulder, in gravel, with no shoes, with no coat, in 40-degree October air. He was moving at a steady pace, not stumbling, not weaving. He was walking the way a man walks when he has been walking for a very long time and has made peace with the distance still ahead. I pulled my cruiser over about 50 yards ahead of him and stepped out. I had my hand near my service weapon out of instinct, but I want to be honest about that instinct. It was not because he looked threatening. It was because nothing about him fit any category I had a procedure for. He was, as Clint had reported, extraordinarily large. I am 6 feet 1 inch tall, and I was considered a large man in Boundary County in 1974. This individual stood at least 6 inches taller than me, and his build made the height almost secondary. His shoulders were wide in the manner of a structural frame rather than muscular bulk, as if the underlying frame itself was broader than a standard human skeleton. His hands, when I could see them as he walked closer, hung low at his sides and looked like they belonged to someone a full foot taller again. The fingers were long, the knuckles heavy, the palms wide enough that my own hand, I would later confirm by trying, fit entirely inside his. He was wearing a flannel shirt in a size that should not commercially exist, and canvas pants that were similarly impossible to account for by any standard measurement. Both garments were worn past the point of identification, the colors bleached and patched and bleached again until they were no color at all. His feet, which were bare on the highway gravel, were large in the same disproportionate way as everything else about him, and the soles were calloused to a depth that explained how he was walking on October road gravel without apparent discomfort. His face is the part I find hardest to describe even now, 50 years later, because it was a human face. I want to be clear about that. It was not a face from a science fiction movie. It was not frightening in any way that science fiction would have you expect. It was a man's face, with eyes and a nose and a jaw and a brow and skin. But every one of those features was calibrated slightly past the range of variation I had seen across 40 years of looking at people's faces. The brow ridge was prominent, heavy, overhanging the deep-set eyes the way you see in old photographs of certain indigenous populations, but pushed further than any of those photographs. The jaw was wide and square and set forward, which changed the geometry of the face. The eyes were dark brown, widely spaced, and the thing I could not stop returning to even in that first look was what they did with the afternoon light off the highway. Animals' eyes reflect light in a particular way, a quality called the tapetum lucidum, the same tissue behind the retina that makes a deer's eyes shine in your headlights at night. Human eyes do not have that structure. This man's eyes did a version of it, not strongly, but enough that I noticed it in the slant of the late afternoon sun coming off the asphalt, and once I noticed it, I could not unnotice it. He stopped walking when I stepped into his path. He looked at me. He did not look aggressive. He did not look frightened. He looked, and I have tried to find a better word for this for 5 decades, exhausted, not tired in the ordinary way, exhausted at some deeper level. Exhaustion that didn't come from missing a night's sleep, but from carrying a weight for too long. "Sir," I said, "I'm Sheriff Harlan Voss, Boundary County. Are you all right?" He looked at me for a long moment, and then he spoke 2 words. "I'm cold." His voice was low, not unnaturally low, not a movie monster low, but low in a register that you feel in your chest rather than just hear with your ears. The phrasing was plain and grammatically correct. The accent was a pattern I could not place. Not regional in any way I recognized, not foreign in any specific sense, just flat and careful. The cadence of someone for whom English was not the first language of whoever had taught him to speak it.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
I told him I could help with that. I asked whether he had any weapons on him, and he answered that he did not. I asked if he would mind if I checked, and he held his arms out to his sides in a gesture of compliance that was so practiced and so immediate that it suggested he understood exactly what I was doing and had been through a process like it before. I patted him down. He was carrying nothing. No wallet, no identification, no keys, no money, nothing in his pockets at all. I put him in the back of my cruiser and drove him to the county jail on Kootenai Street in Bonners Ferry. He folded himself into my back seat as very tall people fold themselves into spaces designed for smaller bodies, methodically and without complaint, tucking his knees sideways to fit. I watched him in the mirror for the 7 minutes it took to drive back to town. He looked out the window at the valley, at the mountains, at the river. He watched the landscape pass with an attention that was less like a man seeing a town for the first time and more like a man memorizing a place he expected to need to find his way back to. My deputy Boyd Marsh was at the office when I arrived. Boyd was 24 at the time. 3 years into the job, a steady and competent young man from Moyi Springs who had grown up hunting and trapping the Selkirks and who was not easily rattled by much of anything the backcountry could produce. Boyd stepped outside when he heard me pull in, and I watched his expression go through about 3 phases in the span of 2 seconds as the door of my cruiser opened and the man I had picked up on Highway 95 unfolded himself out of the back seat. "Good Lord, Harlan," Boyd said quietly, as the man stood to his full height. "Get him something to eat and call Dr. Pruitt," I told him. We did not have a dedicated holding cell for medical purposes. What we had was a 6-cell block attached to the back of the building, built in 1958, out of poured concrete and steel bars that had been designed for the Boundary County inmate population of 1958, which is to say it was built for men of ordinary size. 2 of the cells had bunks wide enough to be usable. The other 4 were standard. I put the man in cell 2, which had the wider bunk, because it seemed like the human thing to do, and the bunk was still not quite wide enough for him to lie on without one shoulder hanging off the edge. I sat at my desk and started a booking sheet. Under name I wrote John Doe. Under height I wrote 6'7", which was my best estimate standing next to him, and I am still not fully confident it was accurate. He may have been taller. Under weight I wrote approximately 300 pounds, which was also an estimate, and which I arrived at by reasoning that he weighed more than any person I had ever physically handled and that the largest person I had ever physically handled had weighed around 260 pounds. Under distinguishing features I wrote, and I am reading from a copy I made of that booking sheet many years later because the originals are long gone. Pronounced supraorbital ridge, unusual skeletal width across shoulders and hands, significant body hair on arms and neck, dark brown to near black in color. Eyes appear to reflect light differently than normal human subjects. No visible tattoos, scars, or other marks except callousing of both feet consistent with extended barefoot travel. I had written dozens of booking sheets. I had never written one with language like that. I sat there after I finished it and read it back to myself, and I thought about tearing it up and starting over with language that sounded less like a field observation report from a biologist. But in the end, I left it because it was accurate, and accuracy was what the form was for. Dr. Eugene Pruitt was the county's contract physician, a general practitioner who had come to Bonners Ferry from Spokane in 1966, and who had never quite gotten around to leaving. He was 51 in 1974, a trim, precise man who wore bifocals on a chain around his neck and who had the calm, methodical manner of a doctor who had been called to unexpected situations often enough that almost nothing surprised him anymore. Almost. He arrived about 40 minutes after Boyd called him, carrying his black bag, which was a genuine black bag, the kind that doctors in 1974 still carried to house calls. I walked him back to cell 2 and unlocked the door. The man who had told me he was cold was sitting on the edge of the bunk with his forearms resting on his knees and his head slightly lowered. Not in a defeated posture, but in the posture of someone conserving something, heat or energy or patience. It was hard to say. Pruitt stopped in the cell doorway and looked at him for a moment before he spoke. Then he introduced himself in the perfectly level voice of a man who had decided to treat this as an ordinary house call, and asked if he had any injuries or anything causing him pain. The man looked at Pruitt and answered that he did not. Pruitt told him he would like to do a basic examination, blood pressure and heart rate and general assessment, if that was agreeable. The man looked at him for a moment and then agreed. What followed was one of the more methodical and ultimately bewildering physical examinations I have ever witnessed, and I was there for all of it. Standing in the cell doorway with Boyd at my shoulder, Pruitt worked through his standard assessment with complete composure, noting findings as he went. Blood pressure, 114/68. Pulse, 48 beats per minute, which is low for a resting adult, and which Pruitt noted carefully. Temperature, 100.6, which Pruitt recorded and then reread, because the first reading had seemed high. Respiratory rate, 10 breaths per minute, again low. Pruitt used a reflex hammer on his knees and noted the reflexes were present but slower in their arc than standard. He checked the eyes and ears, using his pen light in the pupils, and I watched him hold that light at the man's eye for several seconds longer than necessary, moving it back and forth, before he straightened up. He turned toward me, keeping his voice low. His pupils are not constricting normally in the light. There's a partial retinal reflectivity I have not seen before. What does that mean? I asked. I'm not sure yet, Pruitt answered. The examination of his hands took longer than any of the other steps. Pruitt measured the span from the base of the palm to the tip of the middle finger, using a measuring tape from his bag. He measured it twice. He did not read the number out loud. He wrote it in his notepad and turned the notepad so I could not read it from where I was standing, which I found notable but did not challenge at the time. The bone structure of the hands was what held Pruitt's attention longest. He pressed along the metacarpals, the bones of the hand behind the knuckles, and ran his thumb along the edges of each finger joint in turn. He noted, mostly to himself, that the bone density was unlike anything in his clinical memory. He observed that the joint architecture was unfamiliar. He remarked that the width of the proximal phalanges, the bones closest to the palm, fell outside any human reference he could locate, and he said this the way a man says something he has thought over carefully before committing to out loud. He went on to confirm that this was not a measurement error, that he had taken the reading twice, and that both readings were consistent. The man being examined sat through all of this without complaint and without agitation. He watched Pruitt work with the patient, cooperative attention of someone who had been told that this was necessary and had accepted that it was. Once, when Pruitt pressed on a joint harder than the others to test resistance, the man made a small sound, not of pain but of acknowledgement, and Pruitt immediately lightened his pressure and apologized. The man told him it was fine. His voice in that exchange was completely ordinary. A man telling a doctor that it was fine, that the discomfort was nothing to apologize for. When Pruitt was finished, he came out of the cell, and I locked it again. We walked back to my office, and Pruitt sat down in my visitor's chair and took his bifocals off and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, which was not a gesture I had ever seen him make before. "Tell me," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me he had been a physician for 23 years and had examined a great many people, and that he could not tell me what that man was. He was not being dramatic. He was being precise, which was the only way Gene Pruitt knew how to be. He walked me through the vital signs as a whole, explaining that while each individual reading was biologically consistent with a large, healthy human male in excellent physical condition, the specific values clustered at the outer edge of any human range he could locate. The heart rate of 48 would not raise any concern in a serious endurance athlete, he noted. But this was not a man built for that kind of output. The temperature of 100.6 as a resting baseline implied a metabolic rate higher than normal. The pupil behavior was not pathological in the sense of indicating disease or injury, but it was not a response he had observed in a human eye before. He brought up the word tapetum and then corrected himself, noting that this was almost certainly a different structure, something analogous but not identical, and that he did not know what it was. The hands, he told me, were the thing that had rattled him most. He explained why in a single sentence. Hands are the body part about which human medicine has the most precise dimensional data. Given how many centuries of anatomists and surgeons had measured them, and the span he had recorded was not within the published range of human hand measurements. He was clear about this. He was aware of what he was telling me. I asked what he thought we should do. He recommended contact with a hospital in Spokane and probably with the University of Idaho Medical School in Moscow, because there were people with more expertise in skeletal anatomy and ophthalmology than he possessed, and he believed this situation warranted those eyes. I agreed and asked him to write up his examination findings in full detail before he went home. He did. He sat at my desk for an hour and wrote 3 full pages of notes in the small, precise hand of a man trained to document, and he left them with me and drove home. I have the copy I made of those 3 pages. The originals, along with everything else from that arrest, were collected by the 2 federal men the following morning. I went back to the cell block at about 8 o'clock that evening. Boyd was on overnight duty. That I had written down as John Doe was lying on the bunk in cell 2, on his side, his legs slightly bent because the bunk was not long enough for him to lie fully straight. His eyes were open. He was not sleeping. He was looking at the concrete wall of the cell with the same focused attention with which he had watched the mountains through the window of my cruiser. I pulled a chair up outside the bars and sat down. "Do you have a name you want to give me?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he answered, "Caleb." I asked if he had a last name. He told me he did not use one. I asked where he was from, and he looked directly at me and replied, "The Selkirks," with a precision that belonged to a man who knew the individual drainages and ridges and creek names by heart, not the vague geographic gesture most people use when they name a mountain range. I asked how old he was. He told me he did not know exactly, that he thought he was around 30, but that the way his family counted time was different from the calendar years I would be thinking of. He explained only that the years blurred when the seasons were your only measure, and that his mother had told him he was born in a winter of deep snow, and that he had experienced around 30 of those since. That was the moment I understood that this conversation was not going to follow any arc I had a procedure for. So I put down my notepad, and I just talked to him. Over the next hour and a half, sitting outside the bars of Cell 2 in the Boundary County Jail on a Thursday night in October of 1974, I had the most carefully considered conversation of my life. I say carefully considered because both of us were thinking about every word before we spoke, and neither of us was saying the full thing we were thinking, and both of us were aware of that gap. He was intelligent. I want that on the record, and I want it said plainly. Whatever Caleb was, he was not a simple creature operating on instinct. He understood the situation he was in. He understood that I was a law enforcement officer and that he was in a jail cell, and that the question of what happened to him next depended significantly on how this conversation went. He was calculating, not in a manipulative way, but as any intelligent person calculates when they are in a position of vulnerability and have decided that honesty is the most efficient available tool. I asked whether he had any family. He was quiet for a long time. Then he confirmed that he did, that there were others in the mountains, and that some of them were like his mother and some were like him and some were more like his father. I did not push him to elaborate on that immediately because I could feel that the question was close to a loss that was costing him a great deal to sit with. His mother, he eventually told me, had died in the summer of that year. She had been old for a very long time by his father's people's measure, and she had simply come to a stopping point, as old things do. He described it without the emotional affect I would have expected from a man talking about a parent who had died 6 months before, but I did not interpret that as indifference. It was more like a man who had had 6 months to find a way to carry it and had mostly found it. She had been the reason he understood how to speak the way English-speaking people spoke, because she had been born knowing it and had taught it to him as she had taught him everything else. That stopped me. She was born knowing English? I asked. Not exactly, he answered. She had been born understanding all the languages of the people in the valleys, and her people, meaning his father's people, had always been this way, had always been able to understand the valley people's languages even when the valley people had no idea they were being listened to. He was careful to say it was not what I might imagine when I heard the word magic. He described it as attention, generations of close attention, learning the sounds and words of every group of people who had moved into and through those mountain valleys across more years than he could count. His people had been in those mountains before any of the current valley people, and before the people before those people, and the languages had simply accumulated the way anything accumulates when you pay close enough attention for long enough. I asked why he was on the highway. He looked at me for a moment and then explained that his mother had asked him to come down before she died, and that he had promised her he would. She had grown up seeing the valley from the mountains and had always been curious about it in a manner his father's people did not typically share. She had wanted him to at least walk through the valley once, to see the river from the road level instead of from the ridges. She had framed it as a last request, or the nearest thing to one, and he had taken it seriously. "Did you know you'd get picked up?" I asked. "He thought something like it might happen," he acknowledged. He told me he knew he was not the right size for the road. The way he phrased it, I have thought about that sentence for 50 years. He knew he was not the right size for the road. He had walked out of the Selkirks in his mother's honor to see the Kootenai River Valley from the level of the pavement, and he had understood it would not be simple, and he had come anyway. I asked what he wanted to do. He told me he wanted to go back. I told him I would need to make some calls in the morning, that I was not sure what the right procedure was for this situation. And I said it honestly because I genuinely did not know. I told him he was not under arrest in the formal sense, that the holding was for his own safety while I figured out what came next. He told me he understood, and he did not say it with resentment. He said it like a man who had made peace with a detour. I went home that night and lay awake next to my wife Vera with the lights off and the window cracked and the sound of the Kootenai moving somewhere in the dark. And I tried to think through what I was actually dealing with. I was 31 years old. I had been the county sheriff for less than 2 years. I had grown up in Bonner's Ferry and had hunted the Selkirks with my father since I was old enough to carry a rifle, and every hunt had included the standard jokes and stories about Bigfoot sightings that were currency in that part of Idaho, the way weather talk is currency anywhere. I had never given those stories a serious thought. I lay there in the dark and I thought about Caleb's hands. I thought about what Jeanine Pruitt had told me, quietly and precisely, about the dimensional measurements that fell outside published human reference ranges. I thought about the eyes and what Pruitt had observed about the partial retinal reflectivity he had not seen in a human eye before. I thought about the flannel shirt in a size that should not exist, and the canvas pants bleached past any original color, and I tried to imagine a narrative that explained all of it in ordinary terms. A man with a growth disorder, a man with some form of genetic condition that produced unusual proportions, a man who had been raised in the mountains by eccentric parents and had limited experience with roads and towns. I ran that narrative as far as it would go, and somewhere in the small hours of that night, I arrived at the conclusion that it would not go far enough. The measurements Pruitt had taken, the things Pruitt had observed about joint architecture and bone structure, and the specific dimensions of the hands, those things did not fit any growth disorder I had ever heard of, and they did not fit any genetic condition I had ever heard of, and they were not the sort of observation a country doctor with 23 years of practice makes about a patient unless he is very sure of what he is saying. Gene Pruitt was very sure of what he was saying. That was the thing about Pruitt that I had always counted on. and I was counting on it now, whether I wanted to or not. I went back to the jail at 6 in the morning. The overnight log that Boyd had kept showed nothing unusual. No disturbances, no requests, no sounds. Caleb had apparently spent the night lying on the bunk in the same position I had left him in. Or at least that was what Boyd reported, having checked the cell every 45 minutes as was standard. I sent Boyd home to sleep and unlocked the cell door to bring in the breakfast tray. The jail food in Boundary County in 1974 was not sophisticated, but it was honest. Scrambled eggs, toast, a carton of milk from the dairy out on the benchlands. I set it on the edge of the bunk. Caleb sat up and looked at the tray and then looked at me. He thanked me. He ate the eggs with the fork provided, which he used correctly and without apparent unfamiliarity. He drank the milk. He put the carton back on the tray with a care that seemed habitual. The instinct of someone who had been taught not to leave things behind, not to mark your passage. I watched him eat and asked how his mother had come to live in the Selkirks. Whether she had been born there. He put the fork down and considered the question. She had not been born there, he told me. She had come from somewhere farther south, from mountains he believed were in what he called the Oregon country, which I understood to mean somewhere in the Cascades or the mountains of southern Oregon, and she had traveled north at a young age with her own mother, who had been fleeing something he was not fully clear on. The story, as his mother told it, was that the people of that southern range had become too exposed, that something had disturbed their territory badly enough that they had to move, and that his grandmother had brought his mother north through the mountains, following ridges and drainages that kept them out of the valleys and away from roads and settlements until they found the Selkirks and found his father's people there. I asked how old his mother had been when she arrived. Young, he replied. A child. She had arrived among his father's people as a child and had grown up among them, and his father had known her whole life, from her arrival to her death that summer. I asked where his father was now. He was quiet for a full minute after that. He looked at the wall of the cell and I watched something move through his face that I did not have a name for. Not grief, exactly. Not anger. But a feeling between those things that belonged to a man trying to describe a situation for which he had no existing vocabulary. His father was in the mountains, he told me. His father was not like him. He was easier to be around, he acknowledged, because he was smaller, because he looked more like the valley people, and his father did not come down, would not come down, that his father existed in a part of the mountains so deep and so old that the concept of a highway or a town was completely outside anything his father had ever encountered or would ever seek out. I asked whether his father knew where he was right now. His father would know he was missing from the mountains, he answered. He added, with a quiet certainty, his father was very aware of the mountains. I started to ask another question and my radio clicked. It was Betty, earlier than usual, telling me I had a phone call from a number in Coeur d'Alene that she did not recognize. I went to my office and took the call. The man on the other end identified himself as a special agent with a federal agency he named in full. I am not going to repeat the name of that agency here, because I made a promise about that when I signed the document the following day, and even 50 years later, I am going to keep the part of that promise I can still keep. He knew my name, my rank, my county, and the exact time of the arrest the day before. He knew the height estimate. He knew about the examination by Pruitt. He knew I had taken fingerprints. He had information more specific than anything I had put over my own radio or written in my own reports and shared beyond my office walls. Who told you about this? I asked. He replied that the details of that were not a matter he could share. He told me 2 agents would be at my office that morning and that I should not allow anyone else access to the jail block in the meantime. I asked what was going to happen, and he replied that the situation would be handled appropriately. He said it the way people in certain federal positions say things when they have decided that your concern about appropriate handling is not a primary consideration. That man is not under arrest, I told him. He has not committed a crime. There was a pause. Then the agent replied, Sheriff, We appreciate your cooperation." "They deal?" There was a pause. The line went dead. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. I thought about Caleb in that cell. I thought about his face when he told me his mother had died in the summer. I thought about the measured calm with which he had agreed to Pruitt's examination, holding his arms out from his sides because he understood what the gesture meant and because he had apparently decided that cooperation was the best available option. I thought about him eating the eggs with the fork. I went back to the cell block. Caleb was sitting on the edge of the bunk, with his forearms on his knees again, in the same position he had been in the night before, when Pruitt arrived. He looked at me when I came in, and I had the clear impression that he knew a shift had occurred. He was reading my face the way people read faces when they have learned that faces are where the truth lives. "People are coming this morning," I told him. "Federal people. I don't have a lot of information about what happens next." He looked at me and asked quietly and simply, "Will you open the door?" Well, you open the door." He was not pleading. He was asking. I stood there for a long time. I went through everything in my mind as fast as I could. He had not committed a crime. I had no legal basis to hold him. Had told the federal agent as much, and meant it. He was a man who had walked onto a highway without shoes and told me he was cold. Everything after that had been my decision, not the result of anything he had done wrong. I unlocked the cell door. He stood up and came out of the cell and stood in the corridor. And he was so tall in that corridor that the overhead light fixture was at the level of his chin. He looked at me with those dark, wide-set eyes. "The highway is north," I told him. "There's a drainage behind the fairgrounds that runs up into the forest." He understood. He nodded once, a gesture that was completely human in its economy, and he turned and walked down the corridor toward the back of the building. I had unlocked the rear door earlier that morning, which I told myself was standard procedure and which was not standard procedure. He went through it. I heard his footsteps on the gravel behind the jail, and then I did not hear them, and he was gone. The two men arrived at 9:47 that morning. I wrote the time down as they pulled in because I was sitting at my desk with my notepad, and noting the time was a thing to do with my hands. They drove a gray Ford LTD with government plates. They were dressed in suits, dark and without distinction. One was older, somewhere past 50, with gray at his temples and the careful, controlled manner of a man who had been in many rooms where he was the person in charge. The other was younger, 30 or so, with the tightly held stillness of someone who had been trained to observe without reacting. The older one showed me credentials. I looked at them. They were federal. They were real, or real enough that I was not in a position to challenge them. He told me they needed the booking sheet, the fingerprint card, the medical report, and any photographs taken in connection with the individual brought in the day before. "The individual is gone," I replied. He looked at me. A long look. He asked when the subject had left. "This morning, early," I answered. He asked whether I had released him. He was not being held on any charge. I told him. I had no legal basis to detain him. Another long look. He acknowledged that, and then told me they would still need the documentation. I gave them the booking sheet. I gave them the fingerprint card. I gave them the photographs Boyd had taken when we booked him, 3 of them, full face and both profiles, on a standard Polaroid camera. I gave them Pruitt's 3-page examination report. The younger agent collected each item and placed it in a manila envelope. He initialed each item as it went in and sealed the envelope and put it in the briefcase he was carrying. The older one asked whether there was anything else, any personal notes or recordings. "No," I answered, which was true. The copy I had made of the booking sheet and the copy I had made of Pruitt's notes were in a white envelope in my truck, which was parked a block away on Kootenai Street. I had put them there while I was waiting for the federal men to arrive. I am not proud of the deception, but I am not going to apologize for it either. The older agent set a document on my desk. He explained it was a standard non-disclosure agreement, related to federal investigations involving national security, and that he needed my signature, acknowledging that I had not and would not discuss the contents of this investigation with the press, with other law enforcement agencies, or with the public. He drew my attention to a specific section that stated, in terms I want to be careful about not reproducing exactly, that I acknowledged all materials generated in connection with the incident were federal property and that I had surrendered all copies in my possession. I signed it, and I held the knowledge of the envelope in my truck very still inside myself while I did. He shook my hand when I signed. He told me the county was to be commended for its discretion. He said it like he was handing me a commendation. Then they left. The gray Ford backed out of my parking lot and drove north on Highway 95, in the same direction I had driven the morning before to find Caleb walking on the shoulder. I went to my truck and sat in the cab for a long time with the white envelope in my lap. That evening I went to see Gene Pruitt at his house on Aldridge Avenue. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked whether I thought Caleb had gotten back. I told him I thought he probably had. I said the drainage behind the fairgrounds ran up into the Idaho Panhandle National Forest, and from there the Selkirks were accessible without a road for the rest of the way. I told him that any man who had walked barefoot on highway gravel in October without flinching could handle 10 miles of mountain terrain in his sleep. Gene Pruitt looked at his coffee cup for a moment and then looked at me. He wasn't entirely a man, Harlan, he said. He said it gently. The way you say a thing, you have arrived at through a long and careful process and are finally ready to say out loud, no. I agreed. He wasn't entirely. We sat in Pruitt's kitchen for another hour. He had made coffee. The window over his sink looked south toward the edge of town and the line of dark timber beyond it. Somewhere beyond that timber were the Selkirks, and somewhere in the Selkirks was a man who had come down from the mountains to honor his mother's last request and had ended up in a county jail for 14 hours and had been collected by federal agents who had arrived with specific knowledge of specific details that I had never put on any radio or in any report shared beyond the walls of my own office. We talked about that last part for a while, about what it meant that they had known, about what kind of infrastructure would allow two men in a gray Ford to know within hours of an arrest in a 6,000-person county in northern Idaho that a specific individual had been taken into custody, and what that individual's measurements were. Pruitt observed that the existence of that infrastructure was the most disturbing element of the whole sequence, and I agreed with him, because it implied that incidents like mine were not unique. It implied that somewhere there was a file, or more than one file, and that someone had been paying attention to those files long enough to build a response system around them. We decided, that night, not to discuss it further with anyone. Pruitt told me he would keep his copy of his own notes. I told him I would keep mine. We shook hands on it. Neither of us was entirely sure what we were agreeing to, but it felt like the right thing. I went home. Vera was asleep. I put the white envelope in the back of my filing cabinet behind folders related to a civil dispute about a fence line that was never going to be resolved and that nobody would ever have reason to search through, and I went to bed. I kept that envelope in that filing cabinet for 31 years. In 2005, I retired from the last law enforcement consulting work I was doing, closed my office in Bonners Ferry, and moved with Vera to a smaller house on the south side of town. I brought the filing cabinet. I brought the envelope. Gene Pruitt had died in 1993. A heart attack, quick and early, which was an unkind end for a careful, methodical man who had deserved more years. He never spoke about the examination or the findings to anyone, as far as I know. His notes are in my possession now. Vera died in 2012. Boyd Marsh retired from the department in 2001 after a long career. I called him 2 years ago, before I started putting this account together, and asked whether he remembered that October night in 1974. He was quiet for a long moment and then told me he remembered it, and then told me he would prefer not to talk about it and never had talked about it, and that preference had not changed. I told him I understood, and we talked about his grandchildren for a while and said goodbye. I have not called him again. The document I signed for the 2 federal men specified that I was prohibited from discussing the incident with the press, with other law enforcement agencies, and with the public. It did not. I have come to understand, after consulting a retired attorney who has read the document carefully, specifically prohibit me from ever discussing it in any form whatsoever, and the attorney told me that the enforceability of any provision in it was extremely questionable at this point, given both its age and the standard legal interpretation of government non-disclosure agreements from that era. Whether that legal opinion holds up or not is a risk I am prepared to take. I am 79 years old. There are limited consequences I am still available to suffer. There are things I have thought about many times over the 50 years since that night that I want to put on record clearly, because they are the things that stayed with me most, and that I believe matter most for anyone trying to understand what I am describing. The first is the manner in which Caleb moved through an encounter that should, by any ordinary measure, have been destabilizing for a being who had spent his life in the mountains far from roads and towns and jails. He was not destabilized. He was present and composed and thoughtful. When I asked him questions, he considered them before answering. When he answered, he chose his words with a care that suggested he understood the weight of language, that words committed to out loud could not easily be uncommitted to. He was, in every sense that I can articulate, not a person like me, not a person shaped by the same history and context, but a person in the sense of an individual with an interior life, with losses that he was carrying, with commitments he had made and intended to keep, with opinions and knowledge and the capacity for deliberate, considered response. I had arrested people who did not demonstrate that much. The thing I keep returning to, the detail that refuses to lie still in my memory even now, is the period he spent in that cell overnight. Boyd had checked on him every 45 minutes from 10 in the evening through to 6 in the morning, and every check had found him lying on his side on the bunk, facing the wall, still and quiet. Not asleep, Boyd thought, based on the way he would shift slightly when the light came on. Not distressed either, not pacing or pressing against the bars, just still, waiting. I thought about what it must have felt like, lying in that concrete cell with the smell of industrial cleaner and old iron and the sounds of a small town at night coming through the small high window, after a life in the Selkirks, where the sounds at night were wind and water and the cries of whatever moved through the old-growth forest in the dark. I thought about how different those two sets of sensory information must have been, and how much discipline it must have taken to simply lie on that narrow bunk and wait. He had made a promise to his mother. He had come down to keep it. A county sheriff had put him in a cell, and he had waited, quietly, for morning, because that was the situation he was in, and he was not a man who spent energy on things he could not change. I find that patience, in retrospect, one of the most fully human things about him, and also one of the things that most clearly was not ordinary. Most people, put in a cell they had not earned, would have spent the night fighting the injustice of it in some way, internally, if not externally. He had simply accepted it as a condition of the night and waited for the condition to change. That kind of patience belongs to people who have lived with a great deal of time and a great deal of stillness. People who have learned that the world moves at its own pace and that your discomfort with that pace changes nothing. The second thing that stays with me is the matter of his mother. She was, from everything he told me in that hour and a half, fully human in origin. Whatever she had passed to him genetically, she herself had been born to two human parents in the mountains of what Caleb called the Oregon country, had grown up in those mountains, and had met and built a life with someone from a population that was not human in the way I understand human. She had chosen that. She had understood what she was choosing, because she had grown up among people who knew both worlds, at least partially. And she had chosen the mountains and the life that came with them. She had done it fully enough that when she died, she had raised a son who came down from the Selkirks in her honor to walk through the valley she had always watched from above. I have spent a great deal of time over the years trying to imagine what kind of woman she must have been, what her childhood was like. Growing up in whatever community existed in those southern Oregon mountains, learning the languages of the valley people by listening, learning the ways of her father's people and her mother's people simultaneously, navigating a world that was in some fundamental way double, that required her to understand two entirely different sets of rules and expectations. Then the migration north, following ridges and drainages through terrain that most people would not attempt in a lifetime of weekend hiking. Moving through it as a child with her mother, leaving whatever they had known behind because staying had become too dangerous. Arriving in the Selkirks and finding, among his father's people, a home. And then, across the years, building a life with someone from that community, learning what that meant, learning how to teach her son the things he would need to know about both worlds, including a language she had grown up absorbing through walls and distance, and a lifetime of careful listening. She never came down herself, at least not in any way Caleb described. She had watched the valley from the mountains her whole life and had been curious about it, but she had sent her son to see it rather than going herself. Maybe the risk was too great for her. Maybe by the time she was old enough to consider it, she was too deeply shaped by the mountain life to want to walk away from it even briefly. Maybe she had simply decided that the curiosity was enough, that wanting to see a thing and knowing it was there was sufficient, and that the world she had built in the high country was worth more to her than satisfying the want. Caleb did not say, and I did not ask, because I could tell it was not a question he had a simple answer to. What I know is that she asked him to go in her place, and that he went, and that when I met him, walking south along Highway 95, with 40-degree air on his skin and gravel under his bare feet, he had been carrying out a dead woman's wish for as long as it took to walk down from wherever in the Selkirks he had started. I asked him once, during that hour and a half in the cell, whether he had seen what he came to see, whether he had gotten his look at the valley before I stopped him. He was quiet for a moment and then told me he had. He told me he had reached the highway and walked south along the shoulder for about 4 miles before I picked him up, and that in those 4 miles he had seen the Kootenai River running brown and low in its October bed, and had seen the fields that spread out from the river on both sides, and had seen the mountains reflected in a stretch of still water in a low spot off the edge of the benchlands, and that it had been, he said carefully, what he expected it would be. That detail, the reflection in the standing water, I have thought about it so many times over the years that his mother, who had watched this valley from above for her entire life, had somehow communicated to him an appreciation for the specific quality of light on still water. That this appreciation was what she had passed to him, along with the language and the knowledge of the mountain drainages and the bone structure that Pruitt had documented with widening eyes and a careful hand. The third thing that stays with me is the system that found him. I have mentioned this, and I want to return to it because I believe it is the most important element of this entire account from a practical standpoint, and it is the element that receives the least attention in the conversations people have about these encounters. Within 12 hours of Caleb walking onto a highway in a county of 6,000 people in the northernmost corner of Idaho, 2 men in a government vehicle were on their way from Coeur d'Alene with a specific and accurate account of his physical measurements, the name of the examining physician, and knowledge of the fingerprint card. They had not gotten that information from me, from Boyd, from Pruitt, or from Betty. They had gotten it from somewhere else, from a system that was monitoring for exactly this kind of event and had the capacity to identify and respond to it faster than I had any capacity to understand at the time. I have thought about what that system would need to look like. In 1974, There were no cell phones. There was no internet. Communication across distances was by telephone, by radio, or by teletype. The teletype machine in my office connected me to the Idaho State Police Communications Network, and, through that, to the National Crime Information Center, which had come online in 1967 under FBI administration. That network was capable of passing information about criminal records, wanted persons, stolen vehicles. It was not, to my knowledge, designed to flag unusual physical descriptions from routine booking intakes in rural county jails, which means the monitoring had to be operating through a different channel. Either there was someone in my communications chain who was passing information directly, which I considered and could not rule out, or there was some form of systematic review of rural law enforcement activity that I was not aware of and had no way to detect. The federal credentials the men carried were real enough to prevent me from challenging them. The document they had me sign was real enough that I went to a retired attorney 50 years later to ask about its enforceability. These were not improvised responses. They were prepared. Someone had prepared them in advance of a scenario like mine, which means scenarios like mine were anticipated, possibly because they had already happened before. Everything except a white envelope in a truck parked a block away on Kootenai Street. Everything except the memory of a man who has now been retired for 2 decades and who has decided that the shelf life of a federal non-disclosure agreement signed in 1974 does not extend to the better part of a when century. I am telling you this because I was there. Because I looked at Caleb's face in the afternoon light on Highway 95 and saw his eyes do something that human eyes do not do. Because I sat outside his cell for an hour and a half and listened to him describe a life in the Selkirk Mountains and a mother who had wanted to see the valley from road level and had never quite gotten around to it. Because I unlocked his cell door on a Friday morning in October of 1974 and watched him walk out through the back of the Boundary County Jail and disappear into the drainage behind the fairgrounds. And because I have looked at that drainage every time I have driven past the fairgrounds in the 50 years since, and I have never seen him again, and I have never once stopped looking. The Selkirk caribou herd is still there. They are one of the southernmost mountain caribou populations in North America, studied and protected under agreement between the United States and Canada, because the herd crosses the border without reference to which country's biologists are responsible for it in any given season. I read about the herd sometimes. I think about what else moves through that terrain, leaving tracks that no biologist has ever formally cataloged. I think about what the high country looks like in the deep winter, with the old-growth cedar stands carrying snow on their branches and the drainages going quiet under ice, and the ridgelines sharp against a sky that nobody is watching, except whatever has always lived up there. I think Caleb made it back home. I think he crossed the drainage behind the fairgrounds and found the forest and followed it east and up, through the timber that the Idaho Panhandle National Forest manages, and through the timber that it does not manage, and through the high slopes where the management designations stop meaning anything and the mountains are simply themselves. And I think he climbed until he reached the country he knew. And I think that somewhere up in those ridges there was someone who knew he had been away and was waiting for him to come back. I think his father was very aware of the mountains. There is one more thing I want to document, because it bears directly on the question of whether I was the only person in Boundary County who had ever encountered anything like what I encountered that October. In 1981, 7 years after the night with Caleb, I was called out to a property on the east side of the valley, up on the benchlands where the agricultural land gives way to forest and the maintained road turns into a logging track. The call came from a homesteader named Cliff Durgan, who ran a small mixed operation up there, some cattle, a kitchen garden, timber rights, on a couple of sections that he selectively harvested himself. Cliff was in his 60s at the time, a Boundary County native who had lived on that land his whole life and who called the sheriff's department about once a decade when something actually required it. He was not a man who reached for the phone without a reason. He told me he had found something in one of his far pastures that he wanted me to look at before he moved it or disturbed it in any way. He would not say what it was over the phone. He said he thought I should just come and see. I drove up the morning after his call and walked out to the far pasture with him. What he had found was a bed, not a human bed, not a camp with a sleeping bag and a tent, but a nest of a kind, a circular depression pressed into the tall grass at the edge of the timber, maybe 8 feet across, with the grass flattened in a pattern that suggested something very large had lain curled in that spot for a significant period of time. Around the perimeter of the depression, the grass was not just flattened but twisted, woven almost, the way you sometimes see when a large animal has circled before lying down. There were no footprints that I could identify clearly in the dry late summer grass, but at the edge of the timber, where the soil was damper under the shade of the Douglas fir, there were depressions that did not match any animal track I knew, wide, roughly oval, with a toe pattern that was not the round pad of a bear and not the hoofprint of any ungulate and not anything in my experience. Cliff stood next to me looking at those depressions and did not say anything for a while. Then, he told me that this was not the first time he had found a bed like this. He told me the first one had been in 1963, 18 years earlier, in roughly the same location at the forest edge of that far pasture. He told me that one had been in the spring and had smelled strongly of something he could not name, a thick, wild smell that was not any domestic animal he had kept, and not any wild animal he had ever gotten close enough to smell. He told me he had shown it to his father, who had been alive then, and that his father had looked at it and told him to fill it in and not to mention it to anyone. I asked him why his father had said that. Cliff looked at the timberline for a long moment. Then he told me his father had said it because his grandfather had told his father the same thing when his father was a boy, that there were things in the Selkirks that had been there before any of their family, before anyone, and that they were not a problem as long as you did not make yourself a problem to them, and that the less attention you drew to the subject, the better for everyone involved. 3 generations of Durgans, going back at least to the early part of the 20th century, had been finding beds like this at the forest edge of that far pasture. 3 generations had filled them in and not talked about it, because that was what you did in Boundary County with things that did not have a clean explanation, and because the Durgans had made their peace with the understanding that the mountains around them held more than the county records accounted for. I stood in Cliff Durgan's far pasture on a morning in 1981, and I thought about a man in a flannel shirt stepping out of the back door of my jail 7 years before, and I thought about the depressions at the edge of the timber, and I filled in a report that described a large animal bedding site of unknown species, and left it at that, because it was accurate, and because that framing would not invite the attention of the people in Coeur d'Alene with the gray Ford Ltd. Cliff died in 1994. His son sold the property in 2003. I do not know whether the new owners have ever found anything at the edge of that far pasture. I have not driven up to ask. My name is Harlan Voss. In October of 1974, I arrested a man in Boundary County, Idaho, who was not entirely a man, and I let him go. And 2 federal agents took every piece of paper that proved it happened, and I have spent 50 years carrying the story that the paper was supposed to tell. This is that story, told now. Every single detail, exactly as it happened. I did not tell Vera about any of it for a long time. That is something I want to address directly, because it has bothered me across the decades more than the federal men and the non-disclosure agreement and the missing records have. Vera and I were married for 41 years before she died. We raised 2 children in Bonners Ferry. She taught 4th grade at Boundary County Elementary for 30 years. She was the most honest person I have ever known, and I kept a significant thing from her for a long time. And I told myself it was because of the document I had signed, and that was not entirely the truth. The actual truth was that I did not know how to describe what I had seen without sounding like a man who had lost his moorings, and I was not willing to sound that way to my wife. I was a county sheriff. My authority, such as it was, rested on people's confidence in my judgment. That confidence required that I present a consistent picture of a man who dealt in evidence and procedure and verifiable fact. What I had encountered on Highway 95 was none of those things, and I had no framework for talking about it in a form that preserved the picture I needed to preserve. So I carried it alone. For 22 years, I carried it alone, until the fall of 2002, when Vera and I drove up to the benchlands above the valley one Saturday to look at the leaves, which were at their peak that year, the larches gone gold and the aspens burning orange against the dark fir. We were sitting in the truck on a pullout above the valley, looking east toward the Selkirks, the high ridges just showing the first snow of the season, and Vera turned to me and asked what I was thinking about. She had a way of knowing, without being told, when I was somewhere else in my head, and she had learned over 40 years of marriage not to wait for me to volunteer it. I told her. The whole thing, from the radio call that October afternoon to Jean Pruitt's kitchen and the white envelope in the filing cabinet. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the windshield, and her face doing almost nothing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, looking at those gold larch trees against the dark mountains. Then she asked me one question. She asked whether I thought he was at peace in those mountains. I told her I thought he probably was. I told her that from everything he had told me in that hour and a half, the mountains were not a hardship for him. They were the place he was from, the place his father's people had occupied for longer than any of the history I had learned in school could account for, and that going back to them was not returning to difficulty but returning to the only life he had ever known. Vera nodded and looked at the mountains for a while longer. Then she said, "Good." Just that word, good. And she reached over and put her hand on mine for a moment, and then she put it back in her lap, and we sat there looking at the snow on the Selkirks until the light changed and it was time to drive home. I have thought about her reaction many times since. She was not surprised. Not in the way I had expected. Not in the way I had feared. She had grown up in Boundary County, had been a child in these mountains in the 1940s and 50s, and she had grown up with the same quiet understanding that Cliff Durgan had grown up with and that Cliff Durgan's father had grown up with before that. The understanding that there were things in the mountains that did not appear in any official accounting, and that they had been there long enough that the local people had made their peace with the fact of them, even if they did not speak about it openly, and even if they had never seen one close enough to make it undeniable. She had never seen one. But she was not surprised. That told me a great deal about what lived inside the culture of these small northern Idaho communities that I had perhaps underestimated and that I have thought about many times since. I want to talk about the fingerprints, because they are the part of this account that I believe has the most potential significance from a documentary standpoint, and because the loss of the originals represents the single most damaging element of the federal clearance. When I booked Caleb, I took his fingerprints using a standard ink and card method, which was the only method available to Boundary County in 1974. The card was a standard FBI fingerprint card, the same kind used for any booking. Each of the 10 fingers was rolled in ink and pressed to the card in the designated spaces. The prints came out clearly. I have the copy I made of the card, and I have looked at it many times. The prints are recognizably fingerprints. They have ridges and whorls and arches, the same basic structural vocabulary that human fingerprints have, which is itself significant, because the biological literature on fingerprints is clear that the specific ridge patterns of human fingerprints are unique to humans among all primates, and that even our closest primate relatives do not have the same fingerprint structure that we do. Caleb had fingerprints that rolled clean on a standard ink card and that looked, in their basic structure, like human fingerprints. But they were not quite human fingerprints. The ridge density was different. In a standard human fingerprint, the ridges are spaced at roughly 1/10 of a millimeter. Caleb's ridges were spaced wider than that, noticeably wider, and the whorls in his prints were arranged in patterns I did not recognize from the classification guides I had in the office. The FBI at that time used the Henry classification system for fingerprints, a numerical coding based on the pattern types present in each digit, and I attempted to classify Caleb's prints using that system and found that several of his digits did not fit cleanly into any of the 4 standard pattern types that the Henry system recognized. The patterns were close to whorls, but not quite, close to loops, but not quite, and the classification I would have assigned to 2 of his fingers would have been provisional at best. I am not a fingerprint expert. I never claimed to be. What I am is a former law enforcement officer who spent 16 years fingerprinting people as part of standard booking procedure, and who is telling you that the prints I took from Caleb in October of 1974 were recognizably fingerprints with an identifiable human structure, but with specific variations that I could not account for, and that did not fit the standard classification system I was trained to use. The federal men took the fingerprint card along with everything else. I did not make a copy of the fingerprint card, only of the booking sheet and Pruitt's notes. That is the one thing I would do differently if I could go back. There is another element of that 14 hours that I have not yet described, and that I want to be careful about because it is the element I am least certain I can describe accurately. It relates to what Caleb communicated during the night. Boyd had been on overnight duty. His log recorded no disturbances and no activity from the cell block. But when I arrived at 6 in the morning and passed by the other cells on my way to cell 2, I noticed that the 2 cats we kept in the jail, working Mausers who had the run of the building at night and who had been with the department for years, were both in the small office at the far end of the cell block corridor, pressed together in the corner behind the desk, as far from cell 2 as it was possible to get while still being in the building. They did not come out when I passed. They watched me from the corner without moving. I had not thought much about it at the time, being occupied with the morning and the federal call that came shortly after. But when I mentioned it to Pruitt that evening, over the coffee in his kitchen, Pruitt became more attentive than he had been. He asked me to describe it precisely. I told him what I have just told you, that both cats were in the far corner, pressed together, motionless, watching me from a distance they had chosen and were not willing to reduce. Pruitt told me that he had read, in the course of his general medical reading, about the acoustic range of large primates and about the research that had been done, mostly in zoological contexts, on subsonic vocalizations produced by certain large animals, frequencies below the range of human hearing that could nonetheless produce measurable physiological responses in other animals and in some human subjects. He said he had read about this in the context of elephant communication studies that had been conducted in the early 1970s by a researcher at Cornell whose name he could not recall, studies that had found that elephants communicated across distances of several miles using frequencies in the 15 to 20 hertz range, well below the threshold of human auditory perception. He said he wondered whether Caleb had been communicating during the night, not in any language I would recognize, not in any register I would hear, but in a frequency and in a mode that the cats had been aware of and had responded to by putting themselves as far from the source as the building would allow. I have no way to confirm this. I cannot confirm it. Boyd had heard nothing. The building had been quiet. The cats had simply been in the corner when I arrived, and they had stayed in the corner for most of that day, which was not their normal behavior, and by the following morning they had returned to their usual patterns and showed no further unusual behavior. But I have thought about it many times. I have thought about what it would mean for Caleb to have spent that night in the cell communicating in a mode that neither I nor Boyd could detect, sending signals into the dark that his father's people could receive from wherever they were in the Selkirks. I have thought about what those signals would have said. I imagine they would have said something simple and factual. Where he was, that he was unharmed, that he expected to be moving again in the morning. A status report sent in a frequency that traveled through walls and across miles and arrived in the mountains the way a radio signal arrives, carrying information in a form that the receiver was built to process. I imagine his father received it. I imagine the mountains were very aware of it. The question of what exactly Caleb was, genetically and biologically, is one I have wrestled with across 5 decades and am not in a position to answer with certainty. What I can offer is what I observed and what Pruitt documented, and what those observations suggest when placed alongside the limited public literature on the subject. The physical measurements Pruitt recorded were outside published human ranges. The pupil behavior was outside published human norms. The body hair distribution and density were at the extreme outer edge of any human variation I was aware of, and the specific dark color, nearly black in the overhead lighting of the cell block, was consistent with what the comparative anatomy literature would predict for a population that had spent many generations in dense forest environments, where low light was the norm and where pigmentation patterns would be selected for concealment rather than display. The height and the bone structure and the hand dimensions all suggested a body plan that was human in its basic architecture but scaled and proportioned differently, implying a different selective history, pressures toward size and strength and density that would be consistent with a population living in a rugged, high-elevation environment with limited access to the resources that allow smaller-bodied animals to compete successfully. None of that is a definitive answer. None of it adds up, in any honest accounting, to a clinical conclusion about what Caleb was. What it adds up to is a collection of documented observations that do not fit any existing human biological category and that fit, partially and imperfectly, the descriptions that have been accumulating in the witness accounts of people throughout the Pacific Northwest for at least a century and probably much longer. His mother was human. His father was not human in any sense that I can reconcile with the biology I was taught. What Caleb was sat somewhere between those two things, and sat there, functional and intelligent and communicative, and, in the hour and a half I spent talking to him across the bars of a cell in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, deeply and unmistakably personal. In the years after that October, I paid close attention to what was reported in the areas surrounding Boundary County, not officially, not as part of any investigation, but personally, as a man pays attention to a subject that has become important to him. The Selkirks straddle the Idaho-Washington border and extend into British Columbia, and citing reports from all 3 of those jurisdictions trickled through the informal channels that existed among rural law enforcement and hunting communities in the 1970s and 80s. I heard things, I noted them, I never reported them, because I had signed a document and because I had learned that the infrastructure that had appeared in my parking lot in 1974 was still operational and was still paying attention to exactly these kinds of reports. But I built a picture over the years. Not a scientific picture, not a documented picture, but a picture assembled from the fragments that came my way across 16 years in that office and the decades since. The picture was of a population that moved through the high country of the inland Northwest in patterns that were not random but deliberate, that followed seasonal resources the way large ungulates follow seasonal resources, that avoided roads and settlements with a consistency that suggested not just instinct but awareness and planning, and that occasionally, not often but occasionally, came into proximity with people in circumstances that the people found disturbing and the official record found inconvenient. Caleb was not an isolated case. I believe that in 1974, based on the speed and specificity of the federal response, I believe it now, based on 50 years of paying attention to what comes out of the mountains of the inland Northwest. He was one individual from a population, and the population was, and possibly still is, managing its relationship with the valley people, with a sophistication that should astonish anyone who gives it serious thought. They have been in those mountains a very long time, long enough to have learned the languages of every group of people who came through, long enough to have developed a response to the presence of roads and settlements that balances curiosity against risk with a calibration that takes generations to perfect, long enough to have produced, in at least one documented case that I know of personally, An individual who could sit in a county jail cell on a Thursday night in October and eat scrambled eggs with a fork and answer a sheriff's questions in clear, grammatically correct English and express a preference about where he wanted to go and what he wanted to do. And who could, when given the choice, walk out the back door and disappear back into the landscape with no help from anyone and no trace left behind except a set of fingerprints that no longer exist in any official file. I have one final thing to say about Caleb himself, and it is the thing I have saved for last because it is the thing I am most uncertain about and also the thing that matters most to me personally. At the end of our conversation that evening, as I stood up from the chair outside his cell to go back to my office, he looked at me, and he spoke, unprompted, for the first time without me having asked him a question. He said his mother had told him that the valley people were not all the same. She had told him that there were some who looked and kept looking, and some who looked away. She had told him that the ones who looked and kept looking deserved to know what they were looking at, and that someday it would be important that someone tell them. He said he did not know if that day had come. He said he thought I was the looking kind. I did not know what to say to that. I thanked him, and I went back to my office, and I sat at my desk for a long time. I am still sitting at that desk. In a way, 50 years later, I have been looking at those mountains every clear day since that October, and I have not looked away. He said I was the looking kind. I want to believe he was right about that, and about whatever it implied, about why it mattered. I drove past the Boundary County Fairgrounds on a Tuesday last March, a clear morning with the Selkirk showing white above the timberline, the sun coming off the snow and making the ridges look sharp enough to cut. I looked at the drainage behind the fairgrounds, the way I always look. The grass was brown and flattened and wet from the snow melt. The tree line was dark and dense and ordinary in every visible way. I looked for a long time. Then I drove home. The white envelope is in the filing cabinet in my home office, on the south side of Bonners Ferry. Inside it are a copy of a booking sheet with a physical description that does not fit any human being in any medical literature I have ever consulted. Inside it are 3 pages of examination notes written by Gene Pruitt, a country doctor who had 23 years of practice and who chose his words carefully and who wrote, in those 3 pages, that the individual he had examined presented measurements and physiological indicators that he could not account for within any framework available to him, and that he was committing those observations to paper precisely because they were outside his framework and not despite it. I am 79 years old. I will not be making any more drives past the fairgrounds with a clear agenda beyond the drive itself. I will not be telling this story again in any format beyond this one. What I know is in the envelope and in this account, and both of them will outlast me, and what anyone does with what they contain is not something I can control or particularly wish to. Boundary County is still there. The Kootenai River is still there. The Selkirks are still there, old and dense and carrying more within them than any county record or federal archive has ever formally acknowledged. I think his father was very aware of the mountains. I think, on a Thursday night in October of 1974, something in those mountains knew exactly where Caleb was, and knew that he was cold, and knew that he was coming home in the morning. I hope they were glad to have him back. I want to address the question that anyone with law enforcement experience will have been sitting with since the beginning of this account. The question of how a 6-cell block built in 1958 in a small Idaho county jail could have produced a cell that a man of Caleb's size and apparent physical capacity chose not to simply leave. The bars of cell 2 were standard steel, 1 inch in diameter, set 8 inches apart. Standard for a county jail of that era. They would not have stopped a man with his physical strength and bone density from forcing his way through them if he had been determined to do so. The cell door lock was a standard pin tumbler mechanism operated from the corridor side. Nothing that a human being of sufficient determination and leverage could not have eventually defeated. The concrete walls were poured and solid, and those might have given him more trouble than the bars, but the bars and the door were manageable obstacles for someone with the physical resources he clearly had. He did not attempt them. He sat on the bunk and he waited, and when I offered to open the door, he accepted the offer and walked out. He did not force the issue because he had decided not to force the issue. That was a decision made by an individual weighing his options and choosing the path he judged most likely to produce the outcome he wanted, which was to return to the mountains in the morning without causing a disturbance that would complicate things for anyone, including himself. That is what I mean when I say he was intelligent. Not intelligent in the sense of performing a task or solving a puzzle. Intelligent in the sense of having a strategic relationship with time and circumstance, of understanding that the short-term cost of waiting through a night in a cell was lower than the long-term cost of forcing an exit that would create evidence and witnesses and potentially bring more federal attention down on a location that was already, judging by the speed of that phone call, on a federal list somewhere. He was protecting himself. He was protecting whatever was in the mountains he was going back to. He was protecting the drainage behind the fairgrounds, which was the path between those mountains and that jail, and which was a path he could not afford to have watched. Boyd and I had both gone home by the time he left. The rear door was unlocked. There were no witnesses. The drainage behind the fairgrounds was not under surveillance. By the time the federal men arrived at 9:47 and I told them the individual was gone, Caleb had been moving through the Idaho Panhandle National Forest for most of 3 hours, and no amount of federal resources was going to find a person who knew that terrain the way he knew it. Moving in a direction away from every road and every settlement, heading for country that had not seen a maintained trail in decades. He had made the calculation correctly. He had waited out the night, accepted the eggs, walked out the door. I opened, and was gone before anyone with the capacity to stop him had any idea he was moving. That is not animal behavior. That is not instinct. That is a tactical assessment, made in real time by a mind that understood its situation and managed it accordingly. I want to be specific about one more element of the physical examination that I have not yet fully described, because it goes to the question of what Caleb's relationship was to the cold and to the environment more broadly, and because Pruitt's notes on this point are among the most specific and most significant in his 3 pages. Caleb had been found walking barefoot in 40-degree air on gravel. He had been out there, by the evidence of his condition and his account, for at least several hours, if not longer. When Pruitt examined him, his core temperature was 100.6, which is elevated above the normal human resting baseline of 98.6. This was not a man in the early stages of hypothermia. This was a man whose body was running warmer than normal, running warm enough that the 40-degree air and the gravel and the hours of exposure had not lowered his temperature to anything near a dangerous level. His extremities, which Pruitt checked specifically because exposure cases typically show it there first, were not cold. His hands and feet were warm to the touch. The callousing on his feet was extreme, the kind that builds up across years of consistent barefoot travel on rough terrain. And Pruitt noted in his examination that the depth and distribution of the callousing was consistent with a foot that had been conditioned for this kind of surface over a very long period of time, not weeks or months but years. A resting metabolic rate high enough to maintain a core temperature of 100.6 in 40-degree air would require a caloric intake substantially higher than standard human requirements. Pruitt did not perform a metabolic workup, because he did not have the equipment for it in the field, and because the priority of the examination was assessment rather than research. But he noted in his write-up that the basal metabolic indicators, the heart rate, the temperature, the respiratory rate, and the tissue warmth, collectively suggested a metabolic profile that was not consistent with the human baseline and that pointed toward a resting state significantly above human normal. What Caleb ate to maintain that metabolic rate in the Selkirks, and how, is something I do not know and did not ask about. The mountains provided for it somehow. They had been providing for it, and for whatever community he came from, for longer than I could meaningfully imagine. I want to return to something he told me during that conversation. because it has taken on more weight for me over the years than it had at the time. He told me that his mother's people, the human side of his lineage, had come from the Oregon country and had moved north following ridges and drainages to avoid the valleys. He told me his grandmother had brought his mother north because the people of the southern range had become too exposed. He did not elaborate on what had disturbed them, what had made exposure a problem serious enough to require a migration of that length through that terrain with a child. I have thought about the timing. If Caleb was approximately 30 years old in 1974, and if his mother had come north as a young child, then the migration would have occurred roughly in the 1940 range, give or take a decade depending on how young she had been. The 1940s in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest were a period of significant human activity. Wartime timber operations, expanded road building, military training exercises in remote terrain, increased aerial survey activity as the Army and later the Air Force mapped the western interior for strategic purposes. If there was a community of people living in the mountains of southern Oregon or northern California with a dependency on limited exposure to human traffic, the 1940s might well have been a decade that made that community's situation untenable in ways it had not been before. That is speculation. I want to be clear about that. It is the speculation that emerges from sitting with a piece of information for 50 years and thinking about what it might mean in context, and it is not something I can confirm or document. What I can say is that the pattern of migration, following high ridges and remote drainages northward to new territory, is consistent with the behavior of any population under ecological pressure, human or otherwise, and that the destination, the Selkirk Mountains of northern Idaho and southern British Columbia, would represent a logical endpoint for exactly this kind of migration given the quality of the habitat, the remoteness of the terrain, and the existence of an already established population there that, by Caleb's account, received his grandmother and his mother and integrated them into its community. That integration is the part of the story I find most worth considering at length. His mother arrived among his father's people as a child, according to what Caleb told me, and grew up among them. She learned their ways and, presumably, they learned something from her in return. She knew both worlds, the valley world she had grown up adjacent to and the mountain world she had grown up within, and she found a place within the mountain world that was sustainable enough to build a life in. She met his father, who was from that world entirely, and they built something together. And the thing they built produced Caleb, who came down the mountain on bare feet in October of 1974 to see the river his mother had always watched from above. I find the arc of that story, from the southern range to the Selkirks, to a county jail in Bonner's Ferry, to a drainage behind the fairgrounds and back up into the forest, one of the most complete things I have ever been allowed to witness a fragment of. I was the valley sheriff. I was the part of the valley that Caleb walked into, and the part of the valley he walked into had enough sense to open the cell door when he asked, and enough sense to keep a copy of a booking sheet in an envelope in a truck, and enough sense to sit across from a man who was not entirely a man and listen to him talk about his mother for an hour and a half with the attention the subject deserved. His mother told him that some people were the looking kind. I hope she was right. I hope there are enough of the looking kind among whoever hears this account to understand what they are hearing, and to know what to do with it, and to hold it the way it deserves to be held, not as a curiosity, not as a mystery, to be solved and filed and closed, but as a record of contact between two kinds of people who have been sharing the same mountains for longer than either kind's formal history extends, and who managed, for 14 hours in October of 1974, to sit across from each other and speak honestly about what they were and what they wanted and what they owed to the people they had loved and lost. That is what happened in Boundary County, Idaho, in the second week of October, 1974. A man who was not entirely a man walked down from the Selkirks on his mother's instruction, and a sheriff who was not entirely sure of what he was dealing with did the best he could with what he had, and the best turned out to be enough for both of them. The federal men came and went. The records came and went. Caleb came and went. The mountains did not go anywhere. They are still there, east of Bonner's Ferry, east of the Kootenai River and the flat agricultural benchlands and the Highway 95 that runs straight through the valley like a line someone drew to mark the boundary between the world people live in openly and the world that has always existed alongside it, quietly and patiently, and without any particular need for acknowledgement. I look at those mountains every clear morning from my kitchen window. I have been looking at them for 79 years, and I do not expect to stop. They are beautiful and old and full of things I do not have the full accounting of, and I have made my peace with the fact that I never will. Some things are larger than the instruments available to measure them. Some stories are longer than any single telling. Some debts are paid not in documentation but in the willingness to remember and to tell and to trust that the telling will land where it needs to land. This is where I have put it. This is where it lives now, outside the white envelope, outside the 50 years I carried it alone, in the open air where his mother said it would eventually need to be. I hope it reaches the looking kind. There were 3 other incidents during my 16 years as sheriff of Boundary County that I want to document here because they belong to the same picture, even if none of them produced the same kind of direct contact that October night produced. I have not spoken about any of them publicly until now. 2 of them I logged at the time under categories that were technically accurate but incomplete by design. The 3rd I did not log at all. The first was in July of 1977, 3 years after the night with Caleb. I received a call from a Forest Service fire lookout operator named Ted Hanks, who was staffing the Pyramid Peak Lookout Tower on the eastern edge of the county. Pyramid Peak rises to just over 5,000 feet and commands a clear view across a significant stretch of the Selkirk terrain, which is why it had a lookout tower, and Ted Hanks had been staffing that tower for 7 summers in a row and knew the view from it as well as anyone in the county. He was calling to report a figure he had observed moving across an exposed ridge approximately 3 miles to his southeast. He said he had been watching it through the fire scope, which was a good quality optical instrument, and that he had been watching it for about 40 minutes before he called. He was not calling to report a Bigfoot sighting. He was too careful a man for that. He was calling to report that there was a very large person moving in an area that was not accessible by trail and that had no roads within 4 miles in any direction, and that the movement pattern was not consistent with any hiking behavior he had observed across his 7 years of watching that terrain, and that he thought I should know because it was possible, if remotely, that there was an injured or disoriented hiker in an area where rescue would be extremely difficult. He said it carefully and professionally, which was consistent with the man he was. I asked him to describe the figure. He said it was large. He said it was moving on 2 legs. He said it was covering ground faster than any person he had observed through the scope before, and he had observed a fair number of people through that scope over 7 summers. He said it was moving with a consistent gait. Not the gait of a person navigating rough terrain with difficulty, but the gait of something that was on its own ground and knew where it was going. He said the color was dark. Dark clothing or dark body. He could not tell at that distance, even with the scope, but that whatever was moving across that ridge was not making any effort to conceal itself and was not making any effort to follow the terrain the way a cautious hiker follows it. It was moving in a direct line from one side of the exposed ridge to the other and then disappearing over the far edge. I asked how long the figure had been on the exposed ridge. He said approximately 11 minutes from the time he first picked it up to when it crossed out of sight. An exposed ridge of that length covered in 11 minutes at altitude. I thought about the math, and I did not say what I thought about the math. I logged the call as a possible lost hiker report, conducted a check of the Forest Service trail registers for the area, found no hikers logged in for that zone, and closed the report without a search because there was no indication of anyone in distress, and because I had no legal basis to launch a full search team into difficult terrain based on a moving figure that Ted Hanks had observed behaving in a purposeful and non-distressed manner. The report is in the county files as a unresolved possible hiker check. It has never been examined by anyone with federal credentials, as far as I know. Ted Hanks mentioned the figure to me once more, a year later, at a county fair function where I ran into him. He said he thought about it sometimes. He said he had never called it anything specific and had no intention of calling it anything specific, but that he had thought about it. I told him his logs were detailed and professional, and that his call had been the right thing to do. He nodded, and that was the end of the conversation, and I never heard him raise it again. The second incident was in the winter of 1983. A hunting party of 4 men from Spokane had been using a camp in the mountains northeast of Bonners Ferry, in terrain that was accessible by snowmobile along the lower elevations, but that required snowshoes above a certain altitude. They had a legitimate elk permit and had been in the field for 5 days. On the 6th day, one of the 4 men, a man named Gary Pickett, came into my office in Bonners Ferry. He was not injured. He was pale, and the pallor had nothing to do with the cold. He said he needed to talk to someone in an official capacity about something he had observed, and that he was prepared to be told he was mistaken, but that he needed to say it out loud to someone who could put it in a record. I sat him down and got him coffee and asked him to start from the beginning. He told me that on the 5th evening of their hunt, he had gone out alone to check a camera trap he had set near a mineral lick about 1.5 miles from camp. He had reached the lick at dusk and found his camera undisturbed, and he had been crouching in the snow checking the frame counter when he became aware that he was not alone at the lick. He said the awareness came before the sound, a sort of pressure change that he described as the air getting heavy, and then the sound, which was breathing. He said the breathing was too large and too slow to belong to an elk, and too large to belong to a bear in winter torpor, and when he turned his headlamp toward it, he saw what he described as a wall of dark-haired mass approximately 15 feet away from him, upright, with reflective eyes catching the lamp beam at a height that he put at 7.5 to 8 feet above the ground. He said he did not move. He said the figure at the lick did not move. He said they stayed that way for what he estimated was about 2 minutes, neither of them moving, with present, and then the figure turned and walked away into the timber on the far side of the lick without making any sound that he could identify as footfall, which he found nearly as disturbing as the encounter itself. He came in the following morning and told his 3 companions, and they had packed up camp and come down. I took his statement. I asked him whether he had photographs from the camera trap. He said the camera had malfunctioned in the cold and had not taken any usable images. I asked whether any of his companions had seen anything. He said no, that he had been alone at the lick. I asked whether he had felt threatened. He said not exactly. He said he had felt known, which was the word he chose after a pause, that the figure at the lick had observed him with a level of attention that conveyed awareness, not aggression, but awareness, and that being aware of him had seemed to be sufficient for whatever the figure had needed from the encounter. I logged it as an unverified animal encounter report. Category: large mammal, unidentified. The category was technically accurate. It has sat in the county files in that category for 40 years. Gary Pickett's name is the only identifying information from that conversation that I am going to include in this account, because I asked him at the time whether he was willing to have his name on a report, and he said yes, that he was not afraid of it. He said what he saw was real, and that he was not interested in pretending otherwise. I respected that then, and I respect it now. Gary Pickett of Spokane, Washington, stood in my office in February of 1983 and told me calmly and precisely what he had seen at a mineral lick in the Selkirks, and his account was consistent with everything I had seen and heard and thought about in the 9 years since the night with Caleb. The third incident I want to document is the one I did not log at all, and the reason I did not log it is that the witness was my wife, Vera, and the location was our own backyard. It was in August of 1986. Our children were grown and out of the house by then, our son in Boise and our daughter in Portland, and Vera and I were living the quieter rhythms of a couple whose house had gotten larger over the years while the number of people in it had gotten smaller. We had a good-sized property on the east side of Bonners Ferry, at the base of the benchlands, with a long backyard that ended at a fence line, and beyond the fence line a field, and beyond the field the beginning of the timber. It was not remote terrain. It was the edge of town, and there were neighbors within 300 yards in two directions. Vera was up early, as she always was, making coffee before 6 in the morning, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard and the field beyond it and the timber beyond the field. She called me in a tone I recognized as the tone she used when she wanted me to see something without drawing attention to the fact that she wanted me to see something. I came into the kitchen and stood next to her at the window. At the far edge of the backyard, at the fence line, there was a figure. It was standing at the fence with one hand resting on the top rail, looking toward the house. Looking, I thought, toward the kitchen window, which was lit from the inside by the overhead light Vera had turned on when she came down to make coffee. The figure was large. It was large as Caleb had been large, the same breadth at the shoulders, the same impression of a frame that was built differently from a standard human frame. It was dark, and the early morning light was not sufficient for clear detail. It stood at the fence for perhaps 30 seconds after I came into the kitchen, and then it turned and crossed the field in a direction toward the timber with a stride that was long enough to cover the field quickly, and that made almost no sound that I could detect through the kitchen window glass. Vera and I stood at that window for a long time after the figure was gone. Then she poured her coffee and poured mine and set mine on the counter next to me and went and sat at the kitchen table. I asked her if she had seen what she thought she had seen. She looked at me over her coffee cup and told me she had been watching it for almost 3 minutes before she called me in. She said it had been standing at the fence, looking at the kitchen window for 3 minutes, not moving, just standing and looking. That was Vera, interested. I think whatever stood at our fence line on that August morning in 1986 had a reason for being there, the same way Caleb had a reason for being on Highway 95 in October of 1974. I think it was curious. I think it had, perhaps, been aware of me across the 12 years since that October night in a way I had not been aware of it, as the mountains are aware of things that move through them, and that it had come down from the benchlands in the early morning to look at the lit kitchen window of the man who had opened the cell door. I do not know that. I cannot know that. But I have thought about it many times, and that is the explanation that fits the evidence better than any other explanation I can construct. I did not log it, not because I was afraid of it, and not because I thought it should be hidden from the record, but because logging it would have required me to describe it in terms that I was not prepared to use in an official document, and that would have required explanations I was not in a position to give. I was still the county sheriff in 1986. I had 12 more years in that office ahead of me. The envelope was in the filing cabinet and the document was signed, and the gray Ford had not come back, but its existence meant that the infrastructure was still there and still paying attention, and I was not going to give it a reason to pay attention to my house. Vera and I talked about it that morning, and twice more over the following years. And then, after I told her the full story of the night with Caleb in 2002, we talked about it again in that context. She told me then that she thought they were connected, the figure at the fence line and the man on the highway, and I told her I thought so too. She said she hoped whoever it had been had known that it was welcome. She said the least a person could do, when something that old and that careful came that close, was to hold still and let it look. That was Vera. She was not a woman who made things smaller than they were. I want to close this account with something about the Selkirks themselves, because I think the mountains deserve a proper mention at the end of a story that is partly about them. The Selkirk Mountains run roughly 200 miles in a northeast-southwest orientation from southern British Columbia through the panhandle of Idaho and into northeastern Washington. The highest point in the Idaho Selkirks is Smith Peak, which reaches to about 7,500 feet in the Selkirk Crest along the Idaho-Washington border. The range is old, genuinely old, the rock formations going back 400 million years to the late Devonian, and the glacial sculpting of the valleys and the high cirques was ongoing until about 10,000 years ago, which makes the current landscape a relatively recent product of forces that had been working on the underlying rock for an enormous span of time. The forest in the Selkirks is among the most diverse conifer forest in North America. Western red cedar, western hemlock, grand fir, western white pine, Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, mountain hemlock at the higher elevations. Understory plants that include devil's club, queen's cup, and the various berry species, huckleberry and serviceberry and thimbleberry, that produce the caloric density that supports large mammal populations, elk and white-tailed deer and black bear and mountain lion, and, in the high country, a small population of mountain goat and the endangered Selkirk caribou herd that I mentioned earlier, animals that require old-growth forest with abundant arboreal lichens for winter forage and that are found nowhere else in the contiguous United States. The Forest Service manages most of this terrain under the Idaho Panhandle National Forest umbrella, with a patchwork of wilderness areas and roadless areas that limit motorized access to significant portions of the range. There are places in the Selkirks, real places with real names on real maps, where the nearest maintained road is 10 miles or more away and where the terrain between that road and the high country is so dense and so steep that the effective isolation is greater than the distance suggests. In those places, the wilderness is not managed or maintained or made safe for human use. It is simply there, old and complete in itself, full of things that operate entirely outside any human accounting of what belongs in a mountain range and what does not. Caleb was one of those things. His father was one of those things. Whatever stood at the fence line of my backyard in August of 1986 was one of those things. They were not accidents or anomalies. They were residents, with the full weight that word carries when the residency in question predates every map and every county record and every generation of any family in the valley. I have spent 79 years in Boundary County. I know these mountains better than most people who live next to them, because I have spent decades paying attention to what comes out of them and what goes back into them, and what the people who live at their edges understand, quietly and without ceremony, about what lives up there. And what I know, from all of those years and all of that attention, is that the mountains are occupied in ways that the official record does not reflect, and that the occupation is old and self-sustaining and deeply aware of the valley below it, and that it occasionally makes itself known in ways that the valley does not quite know how to handle, but that are neither aggressive nor accidental. Caleb walked down to see the river his mother had always watched from above. That is the whole story, at its core. Everything else, the cell and the federal men and the non-disclosure agreement and the white envelope and the figure at the fence line, is context and consequence. The core of it is a man keeping a promise to his mother. I have kept promises in my life that were harder to keep than that one was for him. I have failed to keep promises that were easier. He walked barefoot through 40-degree air across highway gravel for miles to keep a promise to a dead woman, and when a county sheriff put him in a cell for it, he sat through the night quietly and waited for morning, and when morning came, he walked back into the mountains, and he did not look back. I keep looking. That is what I am left with. The looking. The mountains east of Bonner's Ferry in the clear morning light. The Selkirk crests showing white from October through May. The drainages running dark under old-growth timber. The high ridges where the caribou move and where whatever else lives up there moves alongside them in the same old rhythms, attending to the same old seasons, indifferent to the county lines and the federal jurisdictions and the non-disclosure agreements that the valley has imposed on a landscape that was never consulted about any of it. They are still there. Whatever Caleb's people are, they are still there. The mountains are still there. The evidence is in a white envelope in a filing cabinet in a house in Bonner's Ferry, Idaho. And I am still looking. I want to spend some time with the question of the federal response, because it is the element of this account that carries the most specific and verifiable implications, and because I believe it deserves more careful analysis than I have given it so far in this telling. The man who called me that Friday morning in October of 1974 knew things he should not have been able to know within 12 hours of a routine booking in a small county jail. I have established that. What I have not fully explored is what that knowledge implies about the scope and duration of the surveillance program that produced it. For a federal agency to receive information about a booking in Boundary County, Idaho, within 12 hours, one of several things would have to be true. Either there was an informant inside my communications chain, either in my office or in the Idaho State Police network that my dispatch traffic moved through, or there was electronic surveillance of my communications, which in 1974 would have required physical hardware installed somewhere in my communications infrastructure and federal authorization that would have had to come from somewhere in the Justice Department. Or there was an ongoing physical surveillance presence in Boundary County that had observed the arrest and had reported it up a chain of command quickly enough for the two men to be dispatched by morning. None of those options is simple. None of them is something an agency sets up for a one-time event. All of them imply infrastructure that was already in place and already operational before Caleb walked onto Highway 95, which means the agency that sent those two men had been watching Boundary County, or watching that area of the Selkirks, for long enough to have built that infrastructure, which means they knew before that October that Boundary County was a place where something like my arrest was possible, which means they had reason to believe that the mountains east of Bonner's Ferry were mountains where something like Caleb existed. That is the conclusion that the speed of the response forces, and it is a significant conclusion. It means that whoever sent those two men did not learn that such beings existed when I arrested one. They already knew. They had known long enough to have a protocol and a response team and a non-disclosure document prepared for exactly this situation. They were not discovering something new in October of 1974. They were managing something old. How old, and how many incidents before mine had been processed through the same system, are questions I cannot answer. What I can say is that the protocol they used with me was polished. It was not improvised. The older agent moved through my office with the ease of someone who had done this before, who knew the sequence, who had the document ready before I asked for it, and who had the answer ready before I asked the question. He had done this before. The efficiency of it was the efficiency of repetition, of a procedure that had been performed enough times that it no longer required conscious thought. I think about that when I think about what is not in any public record, not just the records from Boundary County, not just my booking sheet and my fingerprint card and Pruitt's examination notes, but the records from all the other incidents that the same protocol had been applied to in all the other rural counties, in all the other mountain states, where the same drainages run up from the valley floor into the same kind of old-growth forest, and where the same kind of thing that walked out of the Selkirks to honor a dead woman's wish might have walked out onto a road and been found by a rural deputy and generated a booking sheet and a fingerprint card that had subsequently been collected by two men in a government vehicle with real federal credentials and a prepared non-disclosure document. How many filing cabinets are there? In how many county courthouses and sheriff's offices across the West? With how many white envelopes in their backs that contain how many copies of documentation that was never supposed to survive the collection process? I do not know. I suspect the number is not small. I suspect that whatever the federal infrastructure was that operated through my office in October of 1974, it had been operating for decades by then and has continued operating since, and that my experience of it was not unusual except in the detail that I kept a copy of what I had generated before they arrived to take it. That copy exists because I went to my truck early that morning and put it there before the federal men arrived. I did not fully know why I was doing it at the time. I told myself it was standard procedure for a careful law enforcement officer to maintain his own copies of his own documents. That was not entirely accurate. The more accurate reason was that something in the specific nature of that phone call, the speed and the specificity of the knowledge the caller had demonstrated, had told me that whatever was coming to my office that morning was not going to leave space for my own record keeping, and that if I did not create that space before it arrived, there would be no space to create afterward. I acted on that instinct. The instinct turned out to be correct. The copy is what I have, 50 years later, along with the memory of a conversation across jail cell bars with a man who was not entirely a man and who kept his composure through 14 hours in a cell block and ate scrambled eggs with a fork and said thank you when I brought them, and asked me, politely and without pressure, to open the door. I want to also address the matter of what happened to the Selkirk ecosystem in the years following 1974, because it is relevant to any assessment of whether whatever population Caleb came from could still be sustaining itself in that terrain today. The Idaho Panhandle National Forest has undergone significant management changes since the mid-1970s. The roadless area protections that were established under the Carter administration in the 1970s and expanded under subsequent administrations have preserved large areas of the Selkirk terrain from further road development. The Selkirk crest itself, along the Idaho-Washington border, contains roadless areas that are functionally as isolated as they were in 1974, with access for motorized vehicles limited to the lower elevations and the drainage bottoms where logging operations have historically operated. The wildlife corridor between the Selkirks and the Purcell Mountains in British Columbia, which wildlife biologists have studied extensively in the context of the Selkirk caribou herd and the grizzly bear populations that move between the two ranges, remains largely intact. Grizzly bears move through the Kootenai River Valley on a seasonal basis, crossing between the American and Canadian portions of the range with the disregard for political borders that large wilderness animals typically demonstrate. Whatever population Caleb came from would have the same access to the same cross-border terrain, following the same ridges and drainages that the grizzlies follow, moving between habitat blocks with geographic knowledge that accumulates across generations of occupying the same country. The population that Caleb described, his father's people in the Selkirks, his mother's family in what had been the Oregon country, would need, at minimum, a large enough territory to support themselves and a sufficient degree of social organization to maintain a viable breeding group across generations. The Selkirk-Purcell complex, which covers several million acres of largely roadless terrain across Idaho, Washington, and British Columbia, could support a small population of large-bodied primates without difficulty, provided that population was sufficiently skilled at avoiding human contact. The skill Caleb demonstrated in managing his 14 hours in my jail, and the skill the community demonstrated in the decades since in generating almost no verifiable physical evidence of its existence despite being observed at intervals in every decade I am aware of, suggests that the necessary avoidance capability is present and functional. I believe they are still there. I believe they have been there continuously since before the first European map was made of these mountains, and I believe they will be there after the last of the current generation of human residents has moved on or been replaced. The mountains are very old. The people in the mountains are very old. The people in the valley are recent. And we have acted with the historical confidence of the recent in assuming that the landscape belongs to us to categorize and record and account for. The landscape does not particularly agree. What I hope for, in this stage of my life, where hoping has become more prominent than planning, is that whatever contact exists between the valley and the mountains in Boundary County in the years ahead will be managed with the same basic decency that the contact of October 1974 was eventually managed with. I made a mistake that evening by holding him at all, and I corrected the mistake in the morning, and the correction was sufficient. Nobody was harmed. Caleb went home. Whatever his father's people knew about where he had been and what had happened to him, they knew it from Caleb himself, and not from a news report or a federal file or a university study. That is how these things ought to go. With enough good judgment on the human side to recognize when a situation calls for the opening of a door rather than the adding of a lock. With enough humility to acknowledge that the mountains contain populations that have been managing their own relationship with this landscape for longer than our entire recorded history, and that their right to that management is not diminished by our failure to formally acknowledge it. Caleb knew he was not the right size for the road. He knew it, and he went anyway, because his mother had asked him to go. There is something in that something in the acceptance of the risk for the sake of a person who had loved you and made a request of you that belongs to the oldest and most essential category of human behavior. It is not a Bigfoot behavior or a monster behavior. It is a son's behavior. It is what people do when they love someone, and that someone is gone, and keeping the promise is all that is left of the love. I kept my own promises where I could. I kept the copy of the booking sheet. I kept the copy of the examination notes. I kept this account in my head for 50 years, organized and specific, every detail in its proper sequence, because I knew that the telling was going to be necessary eventually and that I owed it to the accuracy that the subject demanded to keep the details correct until I could put them somewhere they would last. Here they are, every one of them, exactly as they happened, in Boundary County, Idaho, in the second week of October, 1974. My name is Harlan Voss. I was the sheriff of Boundary County, Idaho, for 16 years, and on a Friday morning, in the second week of October, 1974, I unlocked a cell door and watched a man walk out through the back of the building and disappear into the drainage behind the fairgrounds. And I have spent the 50 years since being glad that I did it, and not the other thing. The mountains are east of town. I can see them from my kitchen window on every clear morning that I wake up here, which is most of them, and I look at them the way I have always looked at them, with the attention they deserve and the awareness that they hold more than I will ever fully account for. Vera used to ask me what I was searching for when I stood at that window. I told her nothing in particular, which was not entirely honest. What I was looking for was evidence that whatever was up there in October of 1974 was still up there, still managing its own affairs, still capable of sending a son down to the valley on his mother's behalf. I never saw anything from that window that confirmed it. I never saw anything that ruled it out either. For a man at this stage of his life, the absence of disproof is its own kind of answer. I am still looking.